Lebanon's turbulent history in the 20th century was punctuated by a protracted and bloody civil war that took the country to the brink of destruction. The conflict was complex to say the least, with multiple belligerents, both internal and external, that switched sides and alliances regularly. After its conclusion in 1990, an interesting narrative has arisen in certain circles that shifts the blame for the Lebanese civil war to the Palestinians, particularly the militant groups committed to resisting Israel. Their introduction to Lebanon's political scene in the 1970s was certainly of massive importance, and they went on to become major players in the first half of the civil war. But the question still stands: did the Palestinian resistance movement drag Lebanon into a civil war, or were there deeper lying problems within the very infrastructure of the Lebanese state that caused the deadliest civil war in 20th century Middle East? Before we see the role played by the Palestinian resistance movement within the Lebanese civil war, let me tell you about this video's sponsor, MyHeritage. Lebanon's political discourse in the modern period has been heavily influenced by heritage and family backgrounds, because this is an important subject after all. If you'd like to explore your own family history, MyHeritage is the service for you. Using their extensive database of over 19 billion records, MyHeritage will help you create your own family tree. I was able to create my own one, and although my family history is pretty obscure considering it is partially nomadic, and we are talking about rural Afghanistan, they were still able to help me make discoveries about my own family. Through their Discovery Link feature, MyHeritage will help you grow your family tree to several generations back. They have plenty of other helpful services such as their DNA test, which delves into your ancient roots and can get you started building your family tree. Once you've built your tree, you can print it in a variety of different designs. If you upload photos of your ancestors, you can even animate them to see what they were like in motion. My favorite tool is the colorize and enhance feature they have, allowing you to see old black and white images in crisp, vibrant quality. To take advantage of all these great services, click the link in the description or pinned comment below. MyHeritage were good enough to offer Hikmah History subscribers 50% off premium memberships if you decide to continue after the 14-day free trial. Let's get back to history. Civil unrest in the modern period of Lebanon was nothing new. A century earlier, in 1860, Mount Lebanon was engulfed in sectarian strife as the Druze and Maronite Christians went to war with each other. In the aftermath, under European pressure, Ottoman rulers afforded the region a great deal of autonomy, a system which stood in place until the French Mandate after World War I. It was in this period, 1861 to 1918, that the formation of a Lebanese national consciousness really started to take shape. It was also in this period that Lebanese Christians secured a dominant political position, with the Ottoman governor having to be Christian. The Maronites had enjoyed French patronage since the 19th century, and this relationship strengthened even more under the Mandate system. In 1932, a census was carried out which showed the Christians to be a 51% majority. This has been used as the bedrock of a political system that has given the Christians a greater say in running the affairs of the country. During the course of Lebanon's struggle against France to gain independence, Lebanese leaders drew up the National Pact in 1943 to act as a foundation for its multi-confessional political system. Even though the country achieved its goal of becoming independent that same year, the National Pact would come back to haunt them. Important positions within the country's political system were allocated to the different religious groups. Most importantly, Christian ascendancy was secured, as the president and commander of the armed forces had to be Maronites, and within parliament there had to be a ratio of 6-5 in favour of the Christians to Muslims. Considering this system was almost entirely dependent upon demographics, it was a highly sensitive and fragile model, because if demographics changed for whatever reason, it would undermine the very structure of the country's political system. This is where the Palestinians come in. In the aftermath of Israel's creation and the subsequent Arab-Israeli War in 1948, Palestinians experienced something that they refer to as the Nakba, or catastrophe, whereby almost 750,000 of them were forced to become refugees in the surrounding Arab countries. Lebanon inherited 100,000 Palestinian refugees in this period, mostly residing in the south of the country and in large coastal cities such as Sidon. Naturally, many critics domestically felt that the arrival of the largely Sunni Palestinians would upset the delicate sectarian balance, thus resulting in their exclusion from fully integrating with Lebanese society, being left alone in their refugee camps. Despite this, Lebanon would enjoy prosperity throughout the 1950s and 60s. The booming banking sector, as well as its sprawling ports, allowed Western and Persian Gulf investment to pour in as the country became the financial center of the Middle East. The capital, Beirut, was dubbed the Paris of the Middle East and attracted hundreds of thousands of tourists. All the while, Lebanon's underlying political tensions were merely swept under the rug. In June 1967, Israel would score one of the most stunning military victories in modern warfare against the combined forces of Syria, Egypt, and Jordan. In the space of 6 days, they neutralized their foes and moved in to take control of what was left of Palestinian territory. Israeli incursions into the West Bank and Gaza forced even more refugees to flee to surrounding countries. But perhaps the most important side effect of this emphatic victory was that it emboldened independent Palestinian resistance groups to take matters into their own hands and rely less on fellow Arab states to fight on their behalf. Already the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, had been created as an umbrella organization to synchronize the activities of various militant groups. Under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, the PLO would take center stage in the fight against Israel, receiving global attention for their daring raids on Israeli targets. From their headquarters in Jordan, the PLO enjoyed a surge of unprecedented popularity as recruitment for their cause increased massively. The group gained such momentum that by 1970, King Hussein of Jordan felt his position and authority were under attack by the PLO, who some have described as having created a state within a state in Jordan. So King Hussein forced the Palestinian resistance movement out of his country in events that are now known as Black September in 1970. Subsequently, the PLO moved their base to Lebanon. An armed and foreign force was concerning to many Lebanese, particularly the Maronites, but many Lebanese Sunni Muslims welcomed the guerrillas, who they saw as equalizing the balance of power that had so long been tipped in favor of the Christians. Even prior to 1970, the PLO had established itself in southern Lebanon, frequently conducting raids into northern Israel. In 1969, Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser brokered a deal between the PLO and the Lebanese army which would allow Palestinian guerrillas a great deal of freedom to use their numerous refugee camps as bases from which they could attack Israel. South Lebanon was nicknamed Fatah Land because of Arafat's organization, Fatah. Once again, the PLO would create a sort of state within a state. If the demographic shifts that took place after hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees moved in were not enough, there were also sharp ideological differences within Lebanon too. Many Muslims inside the country were sympathetic to Jamal Abdel Nasser's brand of Arab nationalism, which combined pan-Arabist ideas with socialist inclinations and were antagonistic to the West. The Lebanese Christian groups, on the other hand, were much more resistant to this and chose to focus on Lebanon itself and aligning themselves with the West. Maronite political organizations favored a more right-wing approach to politics. The major Maronite political party, the Kataib, was formed by Pierre Gemayel in the 1930s, and it was modeled on the Italian and Spanish fascist parties. So whilst the Muslims felt much more inclined to get involved in affairs that related to Arabs, such as the Palestinian cause, the Christian groups wanted to avoid it. All these religious and ideological tensions reached boiling point in 1975, as constant revenge killings took place between the PLO and the Kataib. The early stages of the war mainly saw two rival coalitions emerge: the Maronite-dominated Lebanese Front and the Lebanese National Movement that incorporated Palestinian, leftists, Shia, Sunni and Druze organizations. The armed clashes between the two groups essentially rendered the Lebanese army ineffective. The war had an especially negative effect on Lebanese national consciousness as people were forced to choose sides along sectarian lines. Lebanese ID cards stated religion on them, thus giving the various militias the ability to set up checkpoints and discriminate on a sectarian basis. Beirut was divided in this way, as the Christians held the eastern portion of the city whilst the Lebanese National Movement took control of the west. The PLO cemented their hold over the south, parts of Beirut and the Palestinian refugee camps. From South Lebanon, they frequently launched attacks on Israel, which ultimately led to a number of military reprisals. The first of these came in 1978, when the Israeli army rolled into southern Lebanon to neutralize the threat of Fedayeen attacks. Although Israel would withdraw later that same year, they left behind a defensive buffer zone that they entrusted to their Christian allies, the South Lebanon Army. The Israeli involvement in the war as a response to Palestinian attacks further complicated Lebanon's civil war. 4 years later, Israel would invade again. This time, they wanted a permanent solution to PLO attacks. So they allied themselves with the Christian Lebanese Front and besieged Beirut. Seeing themselves surrounded and at the prey of aerial attacks, the PLO were given a way out under the protection of international peacekeepers as they accepted defeat and relocated their headquarters to Tunisia. The Lebanese civil war would drag on throughout the 1980s and finally came to an end in 1990. Israel would maintain a presence in Lebanese soil until 2000, when they pulled all personnel out. To put the blame of starting the civil war squarely on the shoulders of the Palestinian resistance movement would be very unfair and not reflective of historical accuracy. In truth, anything as big and complex as a civil war is always going to have multiple causes. In the case of Lebanon, I think it's fair to say that the largest contributory factor for its civil war was its own political system. Even though its political model is largely based on the view that there was a slim majority of Christians in the country, the last time an official national census was conducted was in 1932. Since then, the topic has become a highly sensitive one, making it difficult to know with certainty Lebanon's demography. Nevertheless, it's reasonable to assume that the Muslims now have a majority. This brings forward very difficult questions that Lebanon will have to address. Namely, if its original political system was formed with demography in mind, does that mean it's time to change the country's constitution? It's not too difficult to see why a multi-confessional arrangement would be attractive as a power-sharing agreement in a diverse place like Lebanon. However, it stands to reason that that kind of system would always be fragile in the face of change. If everything stayed the same, then perhaps it could work. But the problem is, things always change, especially in a pivotal region like the Middle East. The PLO certainly precipitated the onset of hostilities in the 1970s, with their apparent ability to build a state-like infrastructure outside the remit of the Lebanese national government, and their constant attacks on Israel also had wider ramifications that affected Lebanon as a whole when the Israelis invaded the country. Nevertheless, if we want to figure out why the Lebanese civil war even happened in the first place, perhaps it might be better to look at the very makeup of Lebanon's political model than to point the finger at a specific antagonist.
Thank you guys for watching, and a special thank you goes out to my Patreons for continuing to support me financially. If you want to do so, click the link in the end screen or in the description to this video, and I would appreciate it a lot. Whatever contribution you can make, that would be awesome. Until next time, peace.